We are going to be in the text of Acts 17 this morning, which is going to kind of do two things. One, it's obviously a very interesting passage that I want to kind of bring a different interpretation to. But number two, it also serves somewhat pragmatically as an entry point for a discussion into the trip that Christchurch is going to be going on, hopefully next May. So about a year from now, we are arranging, about a year, May 21st through May 31st, a 10-day trip to Greece that will essentially walk through Paul's second missionary journey. Talk a little bit more about that at the end. So this is a way of looking at Paul in Greece and doing kind of some of the teaching that we do on the trip, looking at some of the stories kind of in their setting, because these are the places where Paul visits on that second missionary journey as he travels through the book of Acts. It's essentially Acts chapters 16 through 18, which is what the trip will be. And we'll kind of follow Paul's trails as we work from city to city as Paul moved in that area. And so this is a way to kind of bridge that. And then we'll talk a little bit about the pragmatics of the trip at the end. Obviously, there's no rush to sign up. It's 1 year away. But Father Patrick and I discussed that it'd probably be good to get it on everybody's radar, just in terms of preparing, arranging, and saving up for the trip. So we'll talk about that a little bit at the end. So I thought I'd pick one of the most famous texts out of the book of Acts. Whether you're aware of this or not, Acts 17 is one of the most important texts in a lot of different discussions. Not just of the book of Acts, but of Paul, of missionary adventures, of missiology. And just to remind you, in case it's been a while since you've read Acts 17, this is the passage where Paul debates Stoic and Epicurean philosophers in the city of Athens. It's one of the centerpieces of Luke's story, and it's kind of loomed large in the imaginations of lots of interpreters ever since, as a way of Paul kind of interacting with, we're going to put this in quotes, culture, right? This is Paul meeting Stoic philosophers, making friends and influencing people, that kind of very positive approach. What I want to do is kind of look at the story anew through the work of a scholar that I've really respected for a long time named Kevin Rowe. He's a New Testament professor at Duke Seminary, and he wrote an interesting book called Acts Upside Down, I think was the title. Maybe, which gives a unique perspective on a lot of different passages, and this one has stuck with me. What I love about this is it helps us kind of approach texts that we've seen and kind of see them in a new light, and to kind of turn them upside down, no pun intended, and look at them from a different angle and wonder, what have we assumed about this passage? What have we just kind of carried with us, and what does Luke actually say in the text? And so to do that, we're going to kind of walk through some of the interesting clues that Luke gives us in this story that maybe we've been reading it a little bit wrongly. We can have a discussion at the end, whether we like reading A, making friends and influencing people better, or what we see, option 2, a little bit more of a devastating critique. So we'll weigh that out at the end. So this is that passage. If you have Bibles, you can kind of turn to there. We'll be walking through this section. So in Acts 17, Paul actually never meant to go to Athens. If you read down through the narrative quickly, he is actually fleeing Thessalonica because there's some Jewish groups there that are out to get him. And so he kind of hightails it down to Athens. Timothy and Silas take him there and leave him there on kind of pain of death. They think he's going to die. And so he ends up in Athens, not because it was on his itinerary, next stop, but because it's kind of I call it like a layover, right? It's like when your flight gets canceled and you didn't expect to be in that city. If you're like me, what you do is you get out into the city, right? You take that as a great gift and say, I'm going to take my canceled flight and go explore the city. And that's essentially what Paul does. He's there on this kind of layover, right? And so he's walking about in the city, in this major city of the ancient world. Here's some pictures of it from, maybe? There we go. I was there last May, 1 year ago, about now. Obviously famous with the Parthenon, the Acropolis, a very important city. What's interesting, though, by the time that Paul gets there in the first century, it's actually a city on the decline. So it's not holding kind of that force that it had in the 500s BC. Right? It had been surpassed, it had been conquered by Rome, so it's now a Roman colony. In terms of importance and power, it had probably already been passed by Corinth, another city that Paul's going to visit on this journey. and probably Thessalonica was probably even larger than Athens. And so it was a kind of city on the ropes, if you will, kind of living on the fumes of kind of philosophical heritage. And even in terms of education, had been passed by Rome and certainly by Alexandria, Egypt at this point in the first century. So even though Athens looms large for us today as this great kind of philosophical center, it's kind of ebbed and flowed over the years. And by the time Paul gets there, it's not really an important or major city for the Romans by any degree. And so we need to ask again, what's the purpose of this story in the book of Acts? Why does Luke tell it? Why does Paul go there? What's it doing? Again, some have seen it as the climax of the letter. So this is actually Paul's longest and fullest sermon that you find in the book of Acts. So that's rather significant in terms of what Luke is allowing for space. It's the longest that Paul talks, right? Especially to a Gentile audience. It's the biggest text. So let's let one scholar say, this has got to be the climax because Paul's the apostle to the Gentiles. This is the biggest speech. There you go. This is the major event. As I mentioned earlier, a major way of reading the story that I think is well-intended, but perhaps a little bit wrong from this text, is that it's about cultural contextualization, that it's about respectability, that Paul's trying to make a way for the Christian movement in Athens, and showing that he can adapt to Gentile context. If you've ever heard this kind of preached or taught, it's typically quoted, right, that Paul never quotes the Old Testament in this passage, which is kind of true and not true, that he quotes from Greek poets, which is true, so it's supposed to show us how Paul adapts his message to a Gentile audience. That's typically how this passage is approached. I think there's a few little clues in here that, in light of Kevin Rowe's work, that might cause us to see that Paul's actually being thoroughly Jewish in this passage, that he's not kind of leaving behind Judaism. He's not leaving behind the Old Testament specifically, but rather he's incorporating that into a much larger story. That's the part there. So to set up the scene a little bit, there's some key terms at the beginning of the story that kind of might orient us to how Paul might be thinking in this passage. And one of the first ones comes right at the beginning of the story in verse 16. I'll pull it up here. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was deeply distressed. So the entire story, Rowe notes, starts off with this term that in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, is a term that's used for God's anger and jealousy towards idol worship. So, because again, he's going to meet a bunch of idols, and it seems that Luke is putting Paul in a very similar position to Yahweh, to saying he's deeply angered by all this idol worship going on. And you can imagine, for a Jewish person, this is quite shocking to see as many idols being worshipped there. But he moves into the city, and we're going to come back to that at the end of the story. So Rowe notes that at the beginning of the story, we have this kind of negative feature. This term is used over 50 times in the LXX, in the Septuagint, to talk about God being upset at idol worship. So Paul isn't kind of in the middle when he starts. He's actually deeply angry at what he sees there. There's lots of ways we could riff that out. Paul's also concerned that the city is full of idols. So if you imagine him standing in the middle of Athens, he would see multiple temples around him. Temples to Ares, the god of war. Roma and Augusta both had imperial cults in Athens. So he would see emperor worship happening. To his right, he would see the Stoa of Zeus, the temple of Hephaestus, and then, of course, the Parthenon. So you have at least 7 to 8 different temples just in clear view. Yeah?
Are there more idols in Athens than in other cities? It's always sort of surprised me that he's so distressed to see the city full of idols when one might have expected that he would sort of be used to that in his travels and certainly knowing the ancient world
Yeah.
he did. Like, can you shed light on?
Yeah, there'd be a question of degree, right? Now we are going to see this statue to the unknown God, which actually is inscriptional evidence of that. So it does seem that Athens kind of went kind of full tilt on that. But yeah, there would be numerous. I mean, Corinth has 7, 8, 9 temples as well. There's something about Athens, probably as the philosophical center for Luke, that Luke is probably trying to juxtapose. We're going to see this in a minute. Their extreme kind of religiosity juxtaposed to their ignorance. And so I think he might be kind of well, I don't want to say overemphasizing, but kind of dialing that up a little bit to show the juxtaposition there in the story. But yeah, every major city, Rome, Athens, Thessalonica, Philippi, are going to have major temples. And obviously Paul grew up in the diaspora, so he grew up outside the city. So it might not be as shocking for him as much as it's still apparently deeply distressing. So that's a great question. I think for someone like Peter or one of the 12, it probably would have been even more distressing in that regard. It is really interesting. When I was in India in 2015, I saw lots of Buddhist idols kind of coming up out of the waters, and it was a real kind of cognitive dissonance to actually see like things like that daily. And it was just a little bit of like, oh wow, like this isn't what I walk down the street and see. And so I remember when I was there, I did remark on this passage of like, it has to be kind of like the out-of-body context of like, this is real stuff happening. It is that still, I think, a level of distress for him there. So Paul sees all these idols, and of course he's working with Gentiles. He goes into the Agora, which is where the main kind of marketplace is. It's where the people are, right? To quote the great movie, The Little Mermaid, right? That would be where the people are. And so he goes to the Agora, which seems to be his practice, and he teaches. And this is where he gets kind of in conversation with a bunch of philosophers. I should have mentioned this. Hesiod guesses that there's about 30,000 idols in Athens at the time, and Hesiod is an ancient writer of that time. This is potentially where Paul would have been standing around the Stoa. The Agora is right over here. And so this is where he's kind of looking at, this is modern day Athens, obviously. But these temples would have been surrounding him there. This would have been like a lecture hall that, as we see in different places in early Christianity, they rented out to do church. But that's probably where Paul is kind of stated. So he goes to the synagogue, he gets kicked out, he goes to the Agora. That seems to be his practice wherever he goes. And he meets Stoic and Epicurean philosophers. Now, the Stoics were the primary philosophy in the first century. They were the leading philosophical movement of people, of gaining adherence. And I mentioned this at the Occam's Kegger on Tuesday, feels like a week ago, that Paul in many ways looks much more like a traveling philosopher than he does an ancient religious teacher. Mainly because he's calling adherents and calling them to a moral way of life, an ethical way of life. Most of Greco-Roman religion is not concerned with ethics, like a way of living in light of that religious belief. That's the domain of moral philosophy. So Aristotle, Plato, Epictetus, Plutarch, they're the ones writing around what's good, bad, what's evil, what's right, what's wrong, how do you live the good life. This is a very philosophical conversation. So actually when you read Paul's letters, they actually sound a lot more like ancient philosophy than you do ancient religious text, if you take the Old Testament out of the conversation. Right? So for Gentiles, he's going to look much more like a philosopher. And so what it looks like is he's come to town, he's set up shop, and he's trying to gain adherence for his following. And so he meets the Stoics, who are the leading philosophical group in this first century era, who have the widest philosophical reach. They will, throughout the first century, kind of climaxing famously in the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, becoming the kind of Stoic king, right, if you remember Marcus Aurelius. Nero is going to have Seneca as his moral philosopher, as his kind of buddy, and he's a Stoic philosopher. So Stoicism is the main kind of philosophy of the day. So it's not surprising that that's who he's going to meet. And so he meets them there, and he gets charged with two claims. And they're kind of all tarnishes on his reputation. The first one is a little bit more common. You may have heard of this one. He's called a babbler, spermologos, which means that he kind of has the beginnings of philosophical ability, but it's like he's picked up little philosophical words but doesn't really understand the framework. Or as I joke, it's like the college student who took one philosophy class and now thinks that they're a philosopher, right? Like, what does "is" really mean? Right? It's like, okay, you're using all the terms, I don't think you've actually studied philosophy, right? That's kind of their charge against them. You're acting like you're philosophical. Now, I think we can see this two ways. I think Paul actually is deeply philosophical, and we could spend a couple weeks doing that. He's probably not up to the power of a Stoic philosopher, and so they're kind of looking down at him like this kind of new upstart in the Agora, trying to take business from them, right? Students. And so they kind of try to, you're just a babbler, you're kind of like, the image is of this bird who kind of picks up seed, and it's the seeds that drop. That's kind of like his knowledge of ancient philosophies, just these little like tidbits of knowledge. So they charge him with that one, and that one's a little bit innocuous. It's actually the next one that Rowe highlights. It's actually the really difficult one. And they charge him as a proclaimer of foreign deities, foreign divinities, of foreign gods. And it's this one that's the more serious charge. And this is what actually led to Rowe's research of saying, this charge is not innocuous. This is actually a pretty big deal. Because if you know anything about Athens, it's that this is where the trial of Socrates happened. And as Xenophon recollects on what led Socrates to drink hemlock to his death and commit suicide, he says this. This is a quote from Xenophon. I have often wondered by what arguments those who drew up the indictment against Socrates could persuade the Athenians that his life was forfeit to the state. The indictment against him was to this effect. Socrates is guilty of rejecting the gods acknowledged by the state and of bringing in strange deities, foreign deities, same term that Luke uses. He is also guilty of corrupting the youth. That last one always makes me laugh because it doesn't matter. It seems like just a great charge. If you're afraid of something, it's corrupting the kids, right? Whether it's rap music or like video games, like it seems to be a way to get people animated, right? So even back in the first century, it's corrupting the kids, right? But here's the real charge. Socrates is charged with bringing in foreign deities into Athens, and in this famous scene, which in Greek memory led to the death of Socrates, this is the charge. He brings in foreign deities. He's upsetting the social order, and this story was even still quite famous in the first century. And so Luke uses this same term to describe the charge against Paul. And so Rowe mentions that he thinks that Luke has put kind of Paul on trial, just like Socrates, and that that's the stakes of how this conversation is going. And what that does is it kind of resettles the ground that we're interpreting on from a neutral space of like, hey, we're just trying to learn what you're about, we just want to ask some questions, to, oh, they're looking to actually bring a pretty serious charge, potentially of death, towards Paul. And that's what's going to kick off the next scene. And so Rowe mentions that this story, not only do you have Paul in the negative, you also have the Stoic philosophers in the negative. So they're not actually looking to understand one another. They're actually looking, in many ways, despairingly at one another in the story. And so Paul's really not just debating in a casual manner. He's actually, in some ways, being brought up on charges of pretty serious charges in Athenian history. And so in response, Luke says that the philosophers, and here's the key word, they seize him. It's a very interesting verb there. It's not just that they ask him to come to the Areopagus, they take him, right? So he's going there against his will in the story. And this is where the famous scene starts. And by the way, Socrates was also tried at the same location, right? So we got all these layers to this story of, if you're an Athenian, hearing the story going, well, this isn't adding up well. He's got the same charge, he's going to the same location, and by the way, they took him by force. So the Areopagus is not this. This is where the Acropolis is, right? The famous part. The Areopagus, oh, by the way, this is inside the Acropolis, inside the Pantheon. There. This is a statue to Diana. This is actually not in Athens, because if you've ever been there, you're like, wait a second, I didn't see that. But if you've ever been to Nashville, you have. Because this is a picture from the Nashville Art Museum, because they built their art museum within a 1-inch speck of the Pantheon. I don't know why. Parthenon, yeah. I don't know why they did that, but that's how they house all their art, is beneath this thing. But they actually rebuilt the statue in the middle of it. So this is what Paul would have seen had he walked into that place. Where they take Paul is this area called the Areopagus, and it's this rocky outcrop. It's kind of hard to see without light, but that's the Acropolis up there. And so Paul is on this kind of rocky outcrop in front of this region, and this is where the conversation takes place. Here, the main task is he's about for the Areopagus Council, and their main task seems to be evaluating new religious figures in town, new religions, and new teachers, mainly to see if they are kind of a subversive threat I may have mentioned this a couple weeks ago, well, this would have been the winter, that Rome looked at new religions as dangerous because they didn't know if they were going to be supportive of the empire or subversive, right? And so all new religions are looked at as skeptical in the ancient world. And so this Jesus movement is looked at kind of askance as we don't know if we can trust you yet, right? From a Roman kind of point of view. And so what we get here is Paul is not really on a formal trial. This is really what we might call an initial hearing to see if it's worth bringing him up on formal charges. So they're trying to weigh out in some ways, how significant should we take this figure? And so Paul gives his speech. It's got a way to defend himself, literally. Here, we're going to skip some of the rhetoric pieces. And so Paul begins his speech, and this is the other part where Rowe notes that if we read Luke's words, they can kind of be read two ways. So when Paul starts speaking, this is the famous line. So they say, may we know this new teaching that you are presenting. It sounds rather strange to us, so we'd like to know what it means. Luke gives a nice little jab here. Now all the Athenians and the foreigners living there would spend their time in nothing but telling or hearing something new. So he kind of like says they're just kind of caught up in that. So then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. Now that translation into English, extremely religious, is rather interesting because in Greek, it can actually be understood in kind of two different nuances. There's a narrative ambiguity to the word. It can mean extremely devout. It can also mean superstitious. And in English, you can kind of get the different resonances, right? Extremely devout and superstitious are on two opposite ends of the spectrum. And so when Paul says, I see that you are extremely religious, he could be saying, you actually look extremely superstitious to me. I.e., you don't know what you're doing, right? Now, this is the way just that language works, right? Language has narrative ambiguity to it, and sometimes you can use that in really kind of clear ways. I just moved from North Carolina, and there's this phrase in North Carolina, if anyone's ever lived there, that if someone says it to you, they're not complimenting you, and that's the phrase, bless your heart, right? Now, if you're not from the South, right, you could walk away and go, oh, wow, that person, they really enjoyed my presence and thought what I said was really interesting. But what they're saying is, no, I think you're kind of an idiot, right? Good luck, right? And so this word kind of functions with that same kind of cultural ambiguity. Those who have ears to hear it would say, hey, he just insulted us. He said we were superstitious. And others would go, no, I think he complimented us. And so that's the question. What is Paul doing? Is he complimenting them and saying, wow, you're really going for it, right? You're really being religious. Or, and this is where Rose's point, as a Jewish person who's a monotheist, did he say, actually, I think you guys are just practicing superstition over here. I actually don't think you're really religious. And I think the next part of the narrative we're going to build out that I don't think he's complimenting them, right? So this is kind of one of the other pieces that Rome mentions, that this term actually sets the speech off in a different note as well. He's not complimenting them. He's actually kind of low-key making fun of them at some level there. And so this is the point. He talks about their objects of worship, the things that they are devoting their lives to. And then we get this altar to an unknown God. And this is what I mentioned. For many years, many people thought that Luke was just making this up as a way to like embellish his story. But we've actually found a couple of inscriptions. One is from Pausianus, who's kind of a geographer of the ancient world. A guy named Philostratus, who writes a biography. And they both mention statues to unknown gods in Athens. And so I'll just read one of them. This is Philostratus. I do not class as a form of sobriety, for it is much greater proof of wisdom than sobriety to speak well of the gods, especially at Athens, where altars are set up in honor even of the unknown gods. So there's other ancient texts that are referring to the same thing that Luke is referring to here. Oh, wow, the cloud cover really helped. Nice. And so in this, Paul breaks into his speech by doing that. He says, I walked through your city, I saw this statue to an unknown God. And then notice this line. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. This I make known to you. So notice Paul's speech is shifting now. Not only are you superstitious, but I'm going to reveal something to you that you don't know. You actually are in what? Ignorance, and I'm going to make you knowledgeable. That's a very Jewish way of saying these idols, right, are not gods at all. And I'm going to declare to you what? The God who made the world and everything in it. He is the Lord of heaven and earth, and he does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life, breath, and all things. From one ancestor he made all nations to inhabit the whole earth. He allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the place that they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him. Indeed, he is not very far from each one of us. I want to pause it there, because what you have in those first verses is a riff on the Pentateuch. I mean, this is Paul translating the story of Genesis with the creation, with Adam, with the story of Noah, kind of into a Greco-Roman key. But this is where when people say, well, Paul doesn't actually quote the Old Testament, it's like, well, what do you mean by that? Because as a Jewish person, the God who made the world and everything in it has a particular name. Now, he might not say Yahweh, he might not say, well, in Genesis 1:1 it says, right? But he is riffing on a Jewish theology of creation. And that's what he's actually proclaiming to them. That you're living in ignorance, I will proclaim to you what we all Jews believe, right? This, of course, goes back to the classic kind of antipathy, right, between monotheism and polytheism, between Israel and the nations. That we worship the true God, and you don't, right? So Paul is kind of riffing on that. And then he does quote one of their poets, "For him, in him we live, move, and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold, silver, stone, or an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals." And then here comes the key part. "While God has overlooked the times of human ignorance, now he commands all people everywhere to repent." So notice how Paul starts the conversation and ends the conversation. He starts with creation and ends with judgment. And it's within this narrative context that he places the quote of the Greek poet. So this is one of Rowe's points, is that yes, Paul does quote a Greek poet, but he puts it in the context of a narrative that moves from creation to judgment. And he puts it underneath the category of times of ignorance. So he isn't actually using that necessarily as saying, oh, you were almost there, you just need to go a couple steps further. He's actually saying kind of the opposite. You're in ignorance, you're in a time of repentance. So Rowe says this: the entire conversation with pagan philosophy takes place within two parentheses, creation and consummation. The lines from Aratus, that's the poet that he quotes, are embedded within a different framework, one that stretches from Genesis 1 through the resurrection of Jesus to the last day. And so Rowe's point is that even though he quotes the philosopher, it's not as if he's taking, hey, here's this jewel, you kind of guys kind of almost got it. He's saying it's actually within this framework of judgment, of times of ignorance. And then as Rowe mentions, right, and this is kind of interesting that people have missed this, the final call in the sermon that Paul gives is a call for repentance, to go the other way. And so again, if we think of Paul in a kind of traditional mode of trying to win friends and influence people, meeting people with common ground, the story kind of falls shakily on that. That theory falls a little bit shakily on some of the particulars of the text. Particularly when he says, actually, you're not like, you just need like a Jesus top-off to what you were believing. He says you need a 180. Like, you're worshiping an unknown God, it's ignorance, and you need to repent. So when we take all these pieces together, Rowe says, I think we've misunderstood the story. Paul isn't necessarily trying to win friends and influence people. He's actually on the defensive, on a trial for his life, and doing what he always does as a Jewish follower of Jesus, calling people to repentance. And he doesn't do anything different with the Stoic philosophers. And so as we work down through this, these pieces add up to make us think about the story in a different way, of wondering what Paul is doing in this story. He is kind of defending himself. He's giving a defense for the view of God, that it isn't a God made by human hands, which is the charge that he repeats throughout Acts against pagan temples. And we talk about Jewish temples later on, but that's a different story. Something interesting is happening, I think, in Deuteronomy that gets them out of that. But this is where Paul is doing. He's calling them to repentance in the final section of the story. I had that quote up there. Should have remembered that. Sorry. So the aftermath of this, and we'll open up for kind of interrogation after this, is that Paul kind of gets off from the serious scenario with this. When they heard the resurrection of the dead, that's where Paul ends. He's going to judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, for he has been given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. When they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some scoffed, i.e. laughed, and others said, we will hear you again about this. At that point, Paul left them, and then Paul leaves. So apparently he gives a significant enough speech that they think that this guy is just kind of silly. He's talking about the resurrection. He's not a threat. And this makes sense from a Greco-Roman philosophy framework. If anything's true about Greco-Roman philosophy, it's that the body's kind of bad. You don't need it. And so the idea of resurrection, which is a deeply Jewish belief, right, strikes against the major philosophical grain of the ancient world. If you follow Platonic thought, the main goal of life is to get rid of your body, right? It's the prison of the soul. So the idea of getting your body back is kind of going in the wrong direction. So they hear this point about resurrection, they just think it's laughable. This guy can't be taken seriously. He's no threat to us. And so they basically kind of say, we're done here. That's enough. So it's interesting that resurrection is what gets Paul off the hook from the more serious charges. Because again, it's foreign divinities, plural. And this is where the kind of clarity comes in the argument. Originally, they probably think that Paul is talking about two deities, Jesus and the resurrection, i.e. anastasis, so two divinities. But then it becomes clear here, he's actually talking about being risen from the dead. And so that's where they go, okay, we don't think this is anything that we need to be worried about. But interesting enough, Luke gives us this line, some there say, we will hear you again about this. And here's where we get kind of the point of the story, I think, for Luke, is that as Christianity emerges in the Greco-Roman world, as we move into the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christianity and the Jesus movement will actually have to philosophically defend itself, especially as we get into the early church debates about kind of the Trinity. There's going to be deep philosophical work happening to make sure that Christianity belief is credible in that sense, in the ancient sense of philosophical traits. And so we see a lot of deep philosophical work happening post this story. And so many think that Luke may have given us this story to show how Christianity can stand on its own 2 feet when questioned by the leading philosophies of the day, that it might be laughed at, but others are going to hear more. And that Paul isn't a threat to that societal philosophical framework, but rather stands his own. And again, as we go forward in the Christian story, that's going to become true again as they get kind of attacks from the outside, saying that Christians believe in really fanciful things. It's a flight and fancy. You shouldn't believe it if you're an educated person, an intellectual person in the 1st century. This might be one of the ways that story is functioning. The final thing I want to mention about the story before we kind of pause is I find the story very interesting for what it says about Paul's own transformation as a person. And I get this from a scholar named Willie Jennings, who's down at Yale. He notes that the last time that we saw Paul angry in the text of Acts was in Acts chapter 7. And he was around stones. And he stoned Stephen. And Jennings makes the point that there's something about meeting Jesus that when Paul gets deeply distressed again, deeply angered, rather than picking up kind of the stones of Athens to kind of stone people, he actually moves in to debate, to have conversation, to share the good news. And when I reflect on that, it seems there's something about meeting Jesus on the road to Damascus, about hearing about his life and his teaching, that essentially moves Paul from a position of religious violence to religious nonviolence. Because you have a very juxtaposed story here. Paul is angry at what he thinks is false religion, whether that's the Christian group, right, worshiping Jesus, and then the city full of idols. But there's something about his encounter with Jesus that impacts him deeply enough, and I think you can make this case from other texts, that Paul no longer sees religious violence as an option. I think this testifies to that kind of nonviolent tradition in Jesus' own teaching, that when we meet Jesus, we leave violence to the side. And that's how powerful the impact I think Jesus made on Paul. Is that as he walks into the city and he gets deeply angered by what he sees, and I think sometimes that anger is justified. He sees idolatry as a way of oppressing people. For Jewish thought, right, idolatry is linked to oppression and injustice. And so there could be some right anger there of saying this isn't how you should be relating to the creator of the universe. You shouldn't be living in fear. You shouldn't be living in oppression. And want to see some liberation. But what I find interesting for Paul is that he moves forward to share the good news rather than responding in violence. All right, I'll pause it there. We can start poking holes, asking questions. Jonathan?
Thanks, Jason. This is super fascinating with all this. I'm wondering if you could comment on the role of big speeches in the book of Acts. I mean, there's just very interesting parallels between like Acts 2 and Acts 7, and like Peter and Stephen and Paul. And I'd never thought about it as Paul being on trial, but I've always been struck by the reactions, especially in Acts 7. Stephen's giving this speech, and I think from a modern perspective, you think like, oh, it was very interesting and kind of exegetical and stuff. And then the reaction is they're like, let's kill this guy right now, and it's like shocking, at least from a modern perspective. And then in Acts 2, Peter says all this. It's a similar kind of like technical argument, quoting the Old Testament stuff, and then a bunch of people believe, and so they're talking to Jews, as far as I remember. Here he's talking to Gentiles, and then later Paul's talking in front of kings. So I'm wondering if you could just I guess my question is, how do the big speeches in Acts function on a narratival level? Is it basically to say like Christians in the early Jesus movement, they're encountering different audiences with different reactions, and they have to navigate those situations in different ways, or is there a through line?
Yeah, did you ever hear the question of how do speeches function in the book of Acts? Why do we have so many of them, and why do they kind of get different reactions? So sometimes people want to kill the guy talking, right? Sometimes they're actual like defense speeches, like in the latter part of Acts. I think the first thing to say is that what we're looking at just a very technical level is how ancient historiography works. So Greek history writing values speeches. So it doesn't matter if you're reading Xenophon or if you're reading Thucydides or Polybius. All ancient history writing loves speeches. They love first-person reporting. They don't like third-person reporting. And so if Luke is writing an ancient history, which I think he is, he's actually writing it with what ancients expect. They want to hear speeches. And so those speeches are then in the domain of what we call ancient rhetoric. And from there we have all different types of rhetoric. You have rhetoric of praise and blame, you have rhetoric of persuasion, and you have rhetoric of defense. These are all different types of speeches in ancient rhetoric. And we see all three of them on display in the book of Acts. So Acts 2 might be more of like a positive speech, right? Acts 7 and Paul's speeches later on in the book are defense speeches. They're judicial. They're what you give when you're on trial to defend yourself. And it's a little far afield from today, but you could go on a deep dive where Paul and Luke are using all the technical terms in judicial rhetoric to defend themselves. They're giving arguments for that. And so one, I think it just shows how much Luke is writing a first century document with first century expectations, because that's what they want. And then those speeches that are crafted, because I do think, and I'm somewhat in the minority, but I do think our writers of the text of Scripture are actually rhetorically trained, and so they know how to do that. They actually know how to do that personally, because they've been trained in rhetoric. That's a very different conversation, but yeah.
So I thought what you said was really beautifully stated, that he moved from wanting to stone people to persuade or defend the gospel. And the question I have is, in light of our own current situation, this kind of culture war that we're in, and the divided society we're in, what's the better posture? One of confrontation or of persuasion? Or, I mean, it seems to me that his speech at the Areopagus is pretty diplomatic. I mean, he may be calling them out for... But it does seem like he's quoting their poets. He's honoring them by saying, look, I take you seriously. We're going to have a real conversation here. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah, I think it depends on how you take all those particular features.
Can I just add to that? Is that he's also not threatening them with, future wrath due to what they're doing either.
Yeah, I think we'd also note that Paul's definitely in the minority in this situation, right? It's like 1 against 10 in this situation. That certainly probably changes the decorum of it. Like, he can't kind of go in guns blazing, right? I think he realizes that he's on the ropes. So I think there's a little bit of that diplomacy. But I think what you rightly raise is that persuasion, and this is rhetoric, is how Christianity moves forward in the ancient world. It's by persuading people. It's not by commanding them. It's not by demanding them. And this might be a little bit controversial, but I don't think any of Paul's letters in the New Testament are actually in the mode of command. I think they're all in the mode of persuasion. Even the commands are in a persuasive context. Because the groups that are gathering, like we talked about at Occam's Kegger, are what we call voluntary associations. Like, first word is important. They're voluntary. And not to scare anyone, like, no one has to be here. We all choose to be here. And because we choose to be here, we are much more, in ancient terms, like a democratic body, right? And that no one's forcing us, hopefully, right, to be here. But we choose, and because we choose to be here, we now have our choices involved. And so I think that's what the early Christians realized, is that persuasion gets you much farther of showing you why this is good for you, why this is in your best interest. There's lots of texts in 1 Corinthians where Paul says, you should choose this because this is better for you, not worse.
But if you're dealing with entrenched partisan bickering, persuasion almost seems pointless, or it almost seems impossible.
Yeah.
And so then you might resort to what St. Francis says, which is, preach the gospel at all times, in all places, and when necessary, use words. But I mean, you just get to the point where words. People don't want to hear it.
Yes.
They say, don't confuse me with the facts. I already know what I believe.
Yeah, so that's where I think the early Christians combine two kind of counterintuitive things. They include persuasion, which we were like, all right, we like that. We like words, and suffering. I think that's an odd combination, as we're willing to persuade and then suffer for what we believe. And it seems that those two aims, I'm speaking very like 20,000 foot view over the arc of history, seem to be the most persuasive. I think it was the sociologist Rodney Stark that said the success, and he puts that in quotes, but of Christianity was that they outlived, outloved, and outthought their enemies.
What was the last one?
They outlived, they outloved, and they outthought their enemies. And I think you see that throughout Acts. So they outlived them. Martyrdom didn't stop it. We have texts from governors like Pliny writing to Trajan saying, we're killing all these Christians and it's not working. Can we try something else? Right? Like, they'll go to their death. Like, death doesn't cause them fear. Stark said they outloved their neighbors. So they started the first orphanages. They took care of the poor. They fed people. They gave people clothing. That's unheard of in the ancient world. And then they outthought them. And I think this text goes to the outthought them. They said, no, Christianity has a philosophical rationale to it. It is a defensible, in that ancient term, belief, right? You can believe it. You're not suspending your imagination. But you can actually hold on to this as something that's credible, right? Now that changes in different philosophical frameworks, right? If you're in the first century, those arguments may not work today, but there's lots of great Christian philosophers, thinking like the Plantinga family, right, from Grand Rapids, who have done amazing work on saying, no, Christians aren't just these kind of, odd lot that just kind of have faith, but it's an intellectual belief system that makes sense. And so I think Stark's admonition, outliving, outloving, and outthinking their enemies, is what he said kind of led to that. And then we rely on, I think a guy named Kruger, Kruger. And this one's been challenging. He wrote that the genius of the early church, the subtitle of his book was called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. And he said the early church had patience. They took the century view, not the week view. They took the millennium view. Because if they believed God held all of time, then time was no problem for them. And so this patience view of saying, what does success look like? We're not looking at to next month or to next year. We can actually look at a much longer purview. And I think as you look, and I'm not an early church historian, I have colleagues who are, but I think that is the test of it. Over time, these things did work out. Christianity did find its place, its footing, right? But that was over centuries. That wasn't overnight. And certainly I think the challenge for us in our modern world of hyper everything, that's just so countercultural. To say, what does it look like to take the long view of things, rather than we need a quick fix now. And so I think that's where the early church can teach us to take our theological beliefs and really root them in what we believe about God, about others, and about Jesus, and say, all right, if God is in charge of time, how does that change our algorithm? If there is the resurrection, how does that change how we view suffering and death? If people aren't enemies, but people to be loved, how does that change our persuasion? And that's where I think there's a lot more work, right? If we read these texts kind of fully, I think we find a lot of resources for today. Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
One of the things I don't think I'd noticed before, but it seems to me that one of the things Paul does is defending himself, but then he kind of flips the tables
Yeah.
on them and maybe puts them on the defense.
Yep.
And I think that's something when I was teaching, that was something I tried to get
Yeah.
students to see in terms of a modern context, is if you just are playing defense all the time,
Yeah.
then you're not likely to be persuasive.
Yeah.
You've got to ask them the hard questions. Yeah, we've got hard questions to follow people.
Yeah.
Your problem is, what's the question of why they're good? Why do you think it matters at all?
Yeah, there's definitely a two-way street here, and you get that little flip kind of halfway through the story where he kind of takes on a different front. What I think interesting is that he just goes back to classic Jewish belief. There's one God, creator of heaven and earth. There's one person in charge of this all. And that isn't new to Paul. That's what every Jew believes, right? And might have said at some level, minus the Jesus part, right? They would have given a similar narration to this part about human hands, about pagan temples. You can go to Second Temple Jewish texts that have very similar reactions to paganism. So in some ways, Paul is just saying this is just kind of Jewish theology 101 about the gods. And then, of course, for the early Jesus followers, that concludes in Jesus of Nazareth as kind of the climax of that. But it's very interesting where he starts. He's saying, we've always had this story, and I'm going to push that back on you, right? Yeah. Joanne?
He's drawing on the idea that people are made in the image of God, like kind of taking their quote, for we too are his offspring, and then kind of interpreting that in light of the image of God, because he says right below that, like, so, can you scroll up?
Oh, yeah.
Since we're God's offspring, or you could say, like, he's using their language, but since we're
Yeah.
God's, made in God's image, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone. If we're the images of God, then there shouldn't be idols. Like, that is combining that idea with the poet.
Yeah, I think that's where you kind of see the turn. He's like, all right, even if I agreed with you that we're all God's offspring, shouldn't you know that we don't look like that? Like, I think that's this kind of great Jewish kind of polemic, right, of saying, like, kind of nature should teach you, right, that we don't look like that. We're living things. And so, yeah, I think that's where he has this kind of, that's where his argument turns. Because it looks like agreement, right? Well, we all agree we're God's offspring. But then where he goes is that, and shouldn't lead us to these deficient views of what God looks like. It should look more like us, not less like us, right? And then you get the whole human hands thing, which is really fascinating. That's kind of a classic critique of, these are just man-made things. They're not religious at all. They're constructions, right? Straight out of Isaiah, yeah. Yeah, and as I mentioned, and Joanna and Jonathan can certainly contradict me here. I think Judaism also has a temple, right? And so, and it appears that Stephen sometimes is attacking the temple in Acts 7. I don't think he is. I'm working on an article on that right now. More on that later. Because I think Jews in particular have a interesting, in Deuteronomy, God says that he will place his name in the temple. Because there's this like tension, right? If God is omniscient everywhere, how can he be confined to one place in Jerusalem? And I believe Deuteronomy kind of gets you out of that by saying, well, God's going to place his name there, obviously his sanction, but God is still going to be everywhere. He'll be encountered there, but he's not contained there. So Jews have temples, but not in this sense, i.e. you can encounter God in the diaspora. You can pray to him, you can worship him. That's my very New Testament muddled understanding of it. Feel free to correct me. But that, I think, is how they kind of, because if not, then that would seem to be a critique of Judaism too, right? Well, they built a temple. That's why I think it's a little different. Yeah, Dean and then.
Hey, thanks,
Yep.
Jason, so much, because it gets us to the point of how do we communicate the gospel today to our present world?
Yeah.
And how is Paul communicating the gospel? Do we want to blast people? Do we want to defend ourselves? Or do we invite them into a conversation and so forth. So when you see Paul's speech in Acts, it's a shorter one, to the Antiochian church. He's talking to a Jewish group, and he starts talking to them about Jewish history, because that's what they're interested in. And then when you come to Lystra, I think it's in the 15th chapter, but in Lystra, he starts talking about nature, so to sort of bring them in to hear what he has to say. So I'm wondering if it's possible here that we could look at this from the fact that he was complimenting them at being religious, and he was then pointing them to the unknown God. And that to me is a real mystery, because there are hints of monotheism through the polytheistic ancient world, with Akhenaten and in Egypt, and with the Aztecs and so forth. You have these times when there is a sort of a monotheistic breakthrough. So I'm wondering if we couldn't put a little more impact on his talking about the unknown God in a positive way.
Yeah, I think that's been one way of reading the text. I think it all hinges on that term, extremely religious. Depending on how you take that term, it's going to send you down kind of one of two interpretive paradigms. I think what Roe raises is an interesting proposal. But yeah, I think Paul, certainly in the Agora, he isn't, doing like the classic kind of fire and brimstone, right? And I think as a philosophical person, right, he is endearing them, right, to the good life. This is how life ought to run. And Paul is actually deeply stoic in various places himself, particularly on the term self-control. If you ever read self-control in Paul's letters, that's a key term of Stoic philosophy. So Paul has overlap with that. But yeah, I think there's lots of ways that Paul engages various groups. And I think, right, there's not a one size fits all, right? He's very attuned to what each group needs. And I think that's probably what we can learn from him, today.
I don't mean to be off topic,
Yep.
but it made me think you're talking about the temples, the Temple of Jerusalem.
Yep.
And yet you could encounter God other places as well.
Yep.
Is when Jesus is talking with the woman at the well, and we worship, God,
Spirit,
this mountain. Yeah, the Samaritan woman.
Yeah, the Mount Gerizim gets a little interesting because the Samaritans did have their own temple, which to various Jewish groups was a non-starter.
Right.
So they didn't view it as a valid temple.
Of course.
Because again, only one place has the name, right? We do get a couple of temples that we've found throughout the ancient, Jewish temples, by the way. One down in Elephantine, which seem to be, I would argue, aberrations from the normal. But it seems that people want to have their own temple.
Yeah. And Jesus said that you will worship the Father
in spirit and truth. Yeah. And so I think, Jesus is stressing, I think, that omniscience aspect, right? Of that's obviously not just here. I'm very pro-temple in my reading of the New Testament, because I find it interesting that everywhere through Acts you have Jesus and the apostles in the temple, and you don't actually get any negative words about the temple, even with the temple cleansing. The disciples are always there, so I still think it's a place of value. Obviously, it's going to become a non-starter post 70 CE when the temple is destroyed, and most of our texts are written, I think, after 70, so it just becomes a non-issue. But for those first centuries, it was a big deal. But yeah, the early Jesus movement is kind of on the forefront of what will become the reality. There will be no temple. And so they're just kind of on the cutting edge of that. Last thing, when we'll do one more question. So we talked about the Christ Church trip to Greece, May 21st through 31st. If you want to hold those dates kind of in pencil, we're thinking 10 days near the end of May. It essentially has to be after Gordon College's graduation, because I have responsibilities. So I think that's May 17th next year. But we're looking at roughly 10 days, so a week and a weekend. The trip with airfare is approximately $3,500. It's 10 days, and that includes all the hotels, all your breakfast and dinners, all tour guides, tickets, buses, all those things. The only thing you have to pay for are lunches, just because we usually eat kind of on the ground wherever we're at, kind of break for that. And then any, obviously, like souvenirs, things like that. And then tips for the drivers, but that's pretty minimal. We're going to be going through essentially Acts 16 through 18. So I did this last May. We fly into Athens, we fly to Thessalonica, and then we just work down from Philippi, Thessalonica. We hit a 13th century monastery called Meteora, which is in the mountains, which is absolutely breathtaking. We go to Delphi, where the oracles were. We make our way down to Athens for 2 days. We go down to Corinth, and then to Kenkrea, and then back up to Athens. So you essentially walk through all the major cities that Paul goes through. Oh, we go to Berea as well. And so what we do is we kind of lecture on site. So we have a tour guide. I work with a group that I work with now 3 or 4 times. For 30 years, they've been running kind of academic trips to all the places where the Bible was formed. And so it's a turnkey group, so they just run everything. So we show up and just get on the bus, and they take us. And they have tour guides that do all the kind of ancient history, archaeology stuff. And then I do kind of the biblical studies thing. And then Dean, who's going to be with us, will do kind of any sort of pastoral, spiritual formation pieces. And so we read these texts in the places where Paul was at and think about them kind of like we're doing now, and kind of really see the text come alive. It's a really great opportunity to see the Bible kind of jump out, to read parts of Corinthians in Corinth, parts of Philippi in parts of Philippians in Philippi. That was one of my highlights. We get to see potentially where Lydia was baptized, and the house church that was started there. We talked about that a little bit at Occam's-Keker. And so yeah, $3,500, that includes airfare. That's where the asterisk comes in, because we just know how much airfare is. But approximately $3,500, all inclusive of all those things. 10 days, we stay in pretty nice hotels, kind of 3-star, 4-star hotels. So if you're interested in, it's not a dive. It's also not the Ritz-Carlton, but somewhere in the middle. But you get great food, obviously Greek food, great learning. To travel with friends is really, really fun. To learn and kind of grow together, and really get to see the places where Christianity first began, kind of grew. So we'll do this next May, about a year from now. I believe I talked to Patrick. I'm going to do another thing in the fall when we kick off the adult formation again. So I'll remind you again. But we'll probably have an official sign up at some point. So if you're interested, think about it. See if your schedule allows it. We'd love to have you join us. It'll be a fun time. All right. Any thoughts or questions on the trip side of it? Questions on that? It's pretty accessible. So I picked Greece because in Greece what's really nice is our bus rolls up right to the site, and we just walk like 100 feet and you're at the site, so there's not a lot of walking. The biggest walking is actually at the Acropolis, but luckily about 5 years ago they put in an elevator, which we can drop. When I was there, we dropped some people off who were in a wheelchair, and that took them up to the Acropolis and they were able to see it. I have heard that sometimes the elevator can be, working and not working. But that was the most walking was the Acropolis. Everywhere else, the bus stops right at the site and you're off. There's not a lot of walking. Italy is much different. That is a lot of walking. So if you're thinking about, can I do it? Is it accessible? I'd say Greece is probably one of the most accessible places in terms of being close to the sites there.
It won't be 110 degrees.
No, not in May. We'll probably be in the 70s, blue skies. I was there last May and we had great weather. I think it only rained one day when we were in Meteora. The 13th century monastery was incredible. Seeing they're literally on top of mountains, which was amazing. Lots of great art is there, obviously, as well. Lots of icons. Some really fascinating things. Yeah.
Judd and I went on a trip and following the footsteps of Paul years ago with alums from Gordon. Cool. The best cherries I ever ate were up in Thessaloniki.
Oh, wow.
Where we bought them off of a roadside stand. And
my favorite part is the block of feta that they give you at every meal.
Oh, yeah.
Check it down. It's not like sparse little crumbles. Whole thing. Yeah. So, and super fun. But hope you can join us here. Yeah, question? If you have any questions, feel free to chat with me, email me. But we'll probably see it in the bulletin at some point. But thanks for coming, and that's our last one for the year.